Excited about getting our first kind of official recording together done here.
Yeah, I was worried about the other thing being able to be salvaged, but it sounds like they are able to do something with it.
Yeah, so actually, they were able to get it to work. If we're having so many technical issues, I don't know if it's Riverside or just our complete lack of competence doing a podcast. But I mean, hey, we've been able to get it figured out, even though it took us 2 hours to get the microphones to work today. But anyways, Matt, I mean, I know we're kicking off on this Proof of Words podcast thing together. I already kind of did an inaugural sort of pilot episode, if you will, introducing myself, what we're planning on doing with this. As co-host, why don't you introduce yourself really quick before we start diving into this and bring our guest on?
Sure. My name is Matt. I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, by way of Westchester, Pennsylvania, by way of Drexel Hill, Pennsylvania.
Ever make it outside of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, no one outside of our area understands it, but there's a big debate about whether where I live is actually part of Philadelphia. But I'm a Philly boy. I've been doing podcasting for like the last 12 years. I did college radio at Miami, the U in Ohio. So I'm excited to get this kicked off, get to expand my horizons a little bit into the world of crypto. I don't know anything really. I'm a pretty novice.
Well, but I think that's going to be one of the fun dynamics of this show. I mean, we'll get some of the heavy hitters in the Bitcoin and the crypto communities on. We'll be able to ask them questions. And I mean, we'll be able to say like, okay, how do you explain that to a 5-year-old? And we'll test that to see if you understand it or not. If you don't understand it, then, well, okay, fine. Maybe they need to revamp their messaging and narrative. But if you can, then, hey, it worked.
I represent the casual, the lay person, per se, but what I lack in knowledge of crypto and modern finance, I more than make up for in movie quotes, song lyrics, and general knowledge about random things. So I'm looking forward to bring my expertise on Pogs and nothing.
I mean, I think you'll have me beat on everything except maybe Pokemon, but we'll cross that bridge later on. So let me ask you this: Do you own any Bitcoin? Do you own any crypto, or have you avoided that?
I invested in a while back. We had Coinbase. My brother and I shared something, and I gave him money to invest in. I think he invested in Ripple back in the day.
Ooh.
So I didn't put a ton of money in it, but that's the only cryptocurrency. I don't even know if I still own it or if he just dumped it off, but that's really the only crypto that I own.
Well, so we're going to judge the success of this show over the course of the next couple of months or years, however long we do this, based on how much Bitcoin you acquire over that period of time.
To be honest with you, I hadn't touched it yet because I was hoping through this project I'd start to actually understand it, so I didn't feel like I was just throwing money into the wind with not knowing what the hell I was doing.
So that's probably a good way to start. I mean, so the first guest that we're going to have, his name's Mike Schmidt. It's actually a guy that I met in Dubai just a couple of weeks ago. We were all at what is called the Satoshi Roundtable. It's a private get-together of some of the heaviest hitters in the Bitcoin and the crypto space. We all got in the same hotel together. They call it an unconference. You don't have like formal conference agendas like you do if you go to anything else. Basically, it's we all sit in a room, we propose any topic that we want to discuss or talk about. And one of my things, because like the Samara Asset Group, the company I run, we're really tripling down on being a Bitcoin focused company, being a hyper Bitcoin focused investment group, right? So one of the things that I know is that while I understand the investment thesis behind Bitcoin, I know a lot of companies that are building in Bitcoin. I've never actually been exposed to any of the core developers, the people that are actually working on building, maintaining, and upgrading the network over time, right? And I got the chance to meet this guy, Mike, who we're bringing on the show shortly. And he runs a foundation, or rather a charitable organization, for people to contribute charitable financing to, contribute charity to, or give a donation to a donor. You're a donor. Yeah. And basically you can then, they turn around and they finance a developer for a year with the money that is donated. And I was personally very intrigued, particularly to learn how we as Samara might be able to make a donation. So I actually thought bringing somebody like him on that sees not just the macro of Bitcoin, where we talk about the pricing and the volatility and the regulatory all the time, because that's what the media currently focuses on, but rather what's actually being done, what's being built on Bitcoin, and more importantly, what types of projects are being built on Bitcoin that excite him. So without further ado, I guess we'll bring him on and yeah, we'll take it from there. All right, perfect. And I think we're live. So, Mike, thanks for joining us on the podcast. If you'd be so kind as to maybe just give us a quick introduction to yourself, that would be a great way to start off.
Sure. Mike Schmidt. I'm an executive director at Brink, which is a 501c3 not-for-profit that takes funds in from the community and routes those to worthy Bitcoin and Lightning developers who are working on open source software that underpins the entire Bitcoin ecosystem. And some additional work that I do is with a group called Bitcoin Optech, and we do weekly newsletters covering all the developments in Bitcoin and Lightning, discussion on the mailing list, and any in-person meetups and summarizing the meetings there, any changes to software. And we actually recently fired up a podcast for Bitcoin Optech as well, where we have a weekly review of those software updates, and we bring on some of the authors of those pieces of software and independent research that we bring on and chat with them. So those are kind of the two pieces of what I do in the Bitcoin world.
So this is exactly why, and I don't even think I told you this, Mike. You are going to be the first interviewee guest on the Proof of Words podcast. And this is specifically why I wanted it to be you, because I mean, everybody talks about Bitcoin. The mainstream, they talk about Bitcoin. They see the volatilities, they see the price changes, they see the politicians attack it. Nobody gets to see the actual groundwork that's being laid, the groundwork that has been laid by some of the core developers and all of the efforts that go into that core development. So this is why I figured you'd be a perfect guest. So maybe could you tell us a little bit about what it's like working in that ecosystem, and then we'll dive into what people need to do to maybe, or what they need to learn to do to help contribute to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, thank you for giving me the honor of inaugural guest. I'm happy to be here.
I'm not sure as much of
Um,
an honor.
well, so to frame things a little bit, if you're thinking about, people are familiar with Bitcoin, the asset and the exchange rate, and they know that it's some sort of a digital asset, and there's some software behind the scenes that runs it. And knowledge kind of trails off widely from there. So I'll calibrate a bit to get folks on the same page. So, Satoshi wrote the original code that runs the Bitcoin network, early versions, and he was the maintainer for a while. And since then, a group of volunteers has taken over and contributed to that software. And for the first few years of that, it was very much folks donating their time, if you will, to work on the software. There was no such thing as being paid for that. For a long time, Bitcoin didn't even have an exchange rate. So there wasn't really any value to the network per se. But in the recent years, the community's evolved a bit. Obviously, there's interest from an investment perspective, and the price has gone up. And at the same time, there's been some maturity on the development side as well. So you started having groups and individuals getting paid to work on the Bitcoin software, because the Bitcoin software is not done. Regardless of what folks may think about protocol changes to Bitcoin, there are changes that need to be made to the software just to get it to run on the next version of the operating system, let's say. And then there's other changes that could be made to the software to make it more performant or easier to run a node, etc. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and we're getting to the point now where we have developers that are getting paid a full-time wage, whether that be employment at a organization, or whether that be, in the case of Brink, we provide year-long grants for these developers to be able to focus on this work, so that it's not a night and weekends thing, and that people can really level up and not just contribute a few hours a week, which is great. But for those folks who are interested, they can really jump in and work on this full time. And our goal is for this to be something like a feasible career for these people, because this talent is somewhat limited. There's probably a pool of 100 developers, let's say, that work on the Bitcoin core software in any given year and provide contributions to it. And most of those are doing that on their own time, on their own dime. and we want to make sure that we're compensating the high performers so that they can stick around and continue to make important updates to Bitcoin that continue to make and improve on Bitcoin of what it is, what we think it is, this digital bearer asset money.
And this is, I think, a point that a lot of people maybe miss unless they're actually working in the community, unless they're actually engaging with some of the core developers. They don't see all of the different upgrades, all of the different iterations of the Bitcoin main net and all the work that goes into it. They kind of think of, and I think most of people on Earth think about Bitcoin as being this relatively static core code that can never change. And I do think that that's a bit of a problem in how we, the ones that are working in this space, do kind of market Bitcoin to a certain extent. I mean, like for instance, we always say there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. It will never go past that. Bitcoin is as it is. But what a lot of people don't realize is all the stuff that can be built on top of Bitcoin, that can be built into what Bitcoin at its core code is. So, I mean, what are some of the projects, what are some of the iterations that you're seeing that make you the most excited?
Sure. I think there's a couple different ways to parse that question. And I'll maybe categorize things that I think are exciting in the Bitcoin space into things that are happening with regards to the Bitcoin and Lightning softwares, and then things that are interesting that are being built on top of the Bitcoin and Lightning software. And so I think when I'm looking at discussions and groups working on various parts of the Bitcoin code base, I'm excited about a few different things. I could go into a long list, but I think there's a few that are fairly imminent, I would say, like feasible to happen and being worked on actively right now, that I think increase the value of the Bitcoin software and network with regards to this rock that we think it is, this 21 million, this thing that's unchanging. It can still be improved without having to necessarily add features to it. And so some things like that would include, there's a piece of software or a component of the Bitcoin core software called Airlay, and that's an upgrade at the networking level, which essentially makes all these peers in the Bitcoin network, all these different nodes that are talking to each other, be able to talk to each other in a more efficient way, so that your bandwidth isn't eaten up on relaying all these transactions to one another as transactions are relayed on the network. And it makes that much more efficient. And the reason that that's important to Bitcoin, the asset, and Bitcoin, the software, is that now when you run a node, you're spending less bandwidth. There's less resource requirements for yourself or for your network, wherever you may be running your node. And that enables you to actually have more connectivity to other nodes on the network. So you get an even more decentralized network. So that's maybe one example of like, hey, this thing is still what we think it is, but it's an even better version of what we think it is, because now we're even more decentralized using this
And
Airlay
one of the things a lot
protocol.
of pundits will say is that Bitcoin actually isn't decentralized. It's all run by the mining groups, right? It's actually
Mm-hmm.
become more centralized over time. So, I mean, for a layman's perspective, this effectively is what alleviates the pressure from those mining pools, then. Correct?
Well, there's actually other improvements that help with that. Some discussions about Stratum V2 is specifically maybe in a more targeted way affects this mining pool discussion. You'll see maybe posts on social media or the news saying, "Hey, look at this group has 40% of the mining on the network," and the fact is that that is a pool with thousands of different individuals and organizations mining behind it. And right now, there is centralization in the terms of typically the pool, the person operating that pool, even though there's 1,000 other miners mining on their behalf, the pool is the one that does the transaction selection for which transactions are eligible for the next block. And so there is a component of centralization there that is being worked on in the Stratum V2 protocol upgrade. And that's a way, it's a bit outside of Bitcoin Core, but it's a way for miners and mining pools to coordinate such that that one pool representing those thousands of miners no longer makes the transaction selection for what will be in that Bitcoin block. Actually, the individual miners can each do transaction selection and take away that centralization point from a mining perspective. So that's another good point that you bring up about, the mining pool centralization and concerns there, because quite frankly, it's not a concern I'm worried about, but I'm glad that folks are working on this sort of protocol to ensure that those pools aren't abusive of their power.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of narratives out there against Bitcoin. I mean, the two most prominent, obviously, are that it is becoming more centralized through the mining pools and through mining operations. The second one, obviously, the ESG angle, that Bitcoin uses
Hmm.
energy as if that's a bad thing. So it's good to see that there's different groups out there that are working to alleviate those pressures on the core network. Now, one of the things that, I mean, we've kind of been talking about this, those that are in the know, I guess, if you want to phrase it that way, we've been seeing the development of the Lightning Network. We've been seeing different groups, Lightning Labs in particular, River, another great example, that have been building out different functionalities of Lightning. But from a masses perspective, I mean, it really is kind of I'll believe it when I see it sort of thing, right? A lot of these, a lot of the protocols, a lot of this layer twos built in and around the Lightning Network, they're not truly accessible to a lot of people that are out there right now. What do you think needs to happen? What do we need to see happen to actually bring the scalability that Lightning theoretically offers to the masses?
Well, I'll tie one thing you said with Lightning here. You mentioned ESG and a lot of the studies around how much energy goes into a particular Bitcoin transaction and whatnot. And it's a bit of a misnomer there, because not every Bitcoin transaction is one payment, right? So early on, that was the most common way of transacting on Bitcoin, is one transaction to one person. But then we started getting innovations like batching, where an exchange that needs to send out, let's say, a few hundred withdrawals is not going to do a few hundred transactions. They're going to do one transaction and send out all of those payments, if you will, in one transaction. And then you move on to
One
things
block,
like
if
Lightning.
you will.
What's that?
One block, if you will, right? I mean, that's kind of the whole
Yeah.
purpose of the goddamn blockchain.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you add even more payment capacity per transaction to make that distinguish, between payment and transaction, when you involve things like the Lightning Network and other layer twos, where you essentially can make one or two transactions to set up a payment channel in the Lightning Network, and then you're effectively uncapped on the number of payments that you can do given those two Bitcoin transactions. So to try to equate energy usage per Bitcoin transaction is not necessarily a good way to measure it. I don't think. I think payments is a good way to do that, and with Lightning, you get the scalability that you spoke about. And Lightning has been um, where a lot of the newer developers go to be honest. A lot of the startups are in the Lightning space. A lot of the new developers come in through Lightning. There's a bunch of different implementations of Lightning that are speaking together and innovating independently, and also working on a joint spec. To your question about bringing this more to the masses, I think there's some improvements that could be made at, let's say, the Lightning protocol level. There's some improvements that could be made in Bitcoin that potentially help out with Lightning. And there's some work on, let's say, even things like splicing, which right now you set up that transaction on Bitcoin to be able to
You
do
might
all
need to
these
explain
payments in
what that
Lightning.
actually is before we dive into that.
Yeah, yeah. So back to the, you create this transaction that enables you to make all these offline payments. Well, you have this channel with somebody on the Lightning Network, and let's say that you wanted to take some funds out of that and put it back into a Bitcoin transaction. For some reason, you wanted to pay somebody on chain. To do that, currently, you'd actually have to shut down your payment channel with a Lightning partner, and then make that payment, and then reopen a new channel with Lightning. And so it's a bit cumbersome to move your funds around in that regard. Whereas this splicing protocol that's being actively worked on in Lightning allows you to take funds out of a Lightning channel into a traditional Bitcoin transaction, or if you have a Lightning channel with somebody, let's say I have one with you, Patrick, and we have a good rapport, and we're good participants in the Lightning Network, and I want to add funds to that channel so that we can continue to transact with each other with a higher capacity. I can actually take a on-chain Bitcoin transaction and put those funds into our Lightning channel without any downtime. So what I just went through is a bit technical, but I think it gives you the idea of the type of things that are being innovated on Lightning. You can imagine if this splicing protocol comes to fruition, which by all accounts, it's something that could be on mainnet Lightning by the end of the year. You, the friction going in between Lightning and Bitcoin is reduced, and the opportunity cost of having your Bitcoin in a Lightning channel is diminished. And so that would increase the liquidity on the network, which could potentially bring down fees and make sure that things are moving along quicker. It also allows funds to be rebalanced within the Lightning Network to serve all the liquidity for all these payments that are happening off the chain.
So, I mean, definitely very, very technical. And maybe if I'm going to try to simplify this here, effectively what you're seeing happen is different groups are trying to, maybe I should phrase it this way. Like, so the way that I see how adoption happens is when, I mean, at the end of the day, people interact. Okay, they interact with the apps on their phone, right? They interact with. I mean, I use TD Bank when I'm in the U.S. I use N26 when I'm over in Europe, right? As does everybody in the masses. They just use their standard applications. They push a button on their account. It'll Venmo $20 to a friend because that friend bought a round of drinks last night for dinner, and you're just truing up the balance, right? I mean, Bitcoin and Lightning are so much more infinitely complex from a base layer, or at least perceived that way right now. I think because we don't have simplified applications, we don't have simplified user interfaces, we don't have a simple UX that people can engage with, right? And I know that there's layer twos out there that are being built on top of Lightning that are aiming to solve that problem. And the way that I think about this is, I mean, this kind of diminishes how I truly view Bitcoin, but if we just view Bitcoin as a pure protocol layer, right? And in a similar capacity, we view SEPA and SWIFT as a pure protocol layer as well. This is how different international settlements, different intra-bank settlements happen, right? And I don't think anybody in the US, in the masses, ever even heard of what the SWIFT system was until they learned that the Biden
Right.
administration was cutting SWIFT off, or cutting Russia off from SWIFT. Nobody in the US had ever heard of that before unless you worked in banking. And if you think about Bitcoin in that perspective, that it's this base layer, it's a ledger, right? And you're now going to be settling transactions on applications, maybe denominated in Satoshis, maybe denominated in Bitcoin, I don't know, but very likely is probably going to end up being denominated in whatever the local fiat currency is, or at least that's going to be the first iteration of that tech. And Bitcoin is the base layer for those settlements, for those payment layers. I mean, I kind of see that as the only way that we start to have adoption. I think of it in the same sense as when you go on your phone and you have all these different applications. They're coded in iOS, or maybe it's Android. You go on a browser, it's HTTPS, it's TCP/IP. Nobody knows it. Nobody gives a shit unless you're a developer, right? The only thing you know is the application of the website that you're going to. It functions the way that you expect it to. What needs to happen for Bitcoin to get to that level? Because I believe that's the only time that we'd start to see that adoption layer. I mean,
Yeah,
we're not going to get adoption maybe until people don't know they're interacting with Bitcoin.
I think that's fair, and I think that many folks share your viewpoint, myself included. Um, I think that it is a usability issue, and I think right now Lightning is still new. I mean, it's still innovating per the example I gave you on the technical side of the splicing thing. I think the more of those technical pieces that can be in place that facilitate apps to build more usable um, end user applications for folks, the better. I fully agree with that. I think when you have something as new as Lightning Network, sometimes the way the sausage is made is a little bit too exposed to the user, and they have to maybe jump through some strange hoop, or there's some setup that they have to do. But I do think the trajectory is getting better. I think when Lightning first came out, you actually had to have a desktop computer. There were no mobile apps, and you had to do things on the command line in order to open up channels and check balances and send a payment. Well, then we started having mobile applications that talk to that piece of software on your desktop or some server. And now we have Lightning compatible wallets that just run in uh, on the phone or in the browser without having to run all the software behind the scenes. So I think I think if we're on some point of this trajectory of improving the core software and innovations that enable better usability for end users, I think you could look back and say, look at how far we've come. You used to have to run this on a server on a command line, and appreciate where we are now. But you can also, as you're doing, which is look forward and say, what do we need to do to get to the next level? And I agree that there's probably folks that could give you a whole roadmap of things that need to happen at the application layer that they would like to see. And it's great to see a bunch of innovation at the Lightning layer. We actually, as part of Bitcoin Optech, our weekly newsletter, we have a monthly segment that I help author that is covering these sorts of changes in Bitcoin and Lightning softwares, and sometimes that's end user software. And quite frankly, over the last year or so of doing those updates, I've had to kind of really pick and choose what I want to highlight, because there are so many different wallets, there are so many different mobile apps coming out with different niches, different usability trade-offs versus privacy versus self-custody. And so I think there's this sort of explosion of people experimenting on what is the best usability. There's folks like some grantees from Spiral, which is Block's organization that funds some design work and usability work. And we now have people, actually professionals, working on these exact sorts of problems, which none of that existed, a few years ago. So I think you can look both ways on this usability trajectory. You can be happy about where we are, and you can be excited about where this could go.
So, I mean, my next question would be, where do you see it going? What are the next things that you think need to be built to help us get to the next evolutionary cycle of whatever the Bitcoin and the Lightning Network may be able to offer?
Sure. I mean, there's a few things. If I gave you my Erlay Bitcoin layer improvements previously, I can give you now what I'm excited about, or what I think has promise, or a lot of at least discussion and energy in the Bitcoin world about building on top of Bitcoin and Lightning. So I think there's a lot of discussion about, let's say, Fedi and Fedimint, which is a way to sort of have your funds locked in a community, if you will, a community of signers, such that you can actually, this idea goes back, I think to the 80s or early 90s with Chaumian eCash, and the ability to kind of set your Bitcoin aside in a group setting and being able to transact with one another completely off chain, completely privacy, Lightning integrated. And that kind of helps onboard some of the uncles and aunts and maybe grandparents onto Bitcoin, because they're not fully operating independently. You can maybe help them out with some things. And obviously the privacy and scalability that comes along with that is very valuable. So that's a new project in the last year or two that is pretty exciting, and helps with, we've mentioned scalability, privacy, and usability there as well. That's an interesting project. I'm not sure. Have you heard of Fedi before? That's maybe an interesting one to look into. There's some startups that are forming around that style of software with these eCash mints. Something else that's not directly Bitcoin related, but it did come out of the Bitcoin ecosystem, and it's getting a lot of energy, the same type of energy I think Bitcoin got early on, which is like, this thing seems like it's got potential, and that's Noster. And this notion of peer-to-peer social media kind of thing, uncensorable, while also being flexible enough to support a lot of things that aren't social media. So for example, there's a bunch of mobile apps right now where you can go on and you can have a user account. We can interact with each other in a very Twitter-like capacity, but Lightning's built in due to the underlying architecture of Noster. And so you can very easily tip somebody, or instead of liking something and hitting a button, you actually hit a button and somebody gets a few sats over the Lightning Network, because the Lightning Network's somewhat baked in at a lower level than some other social media platforms. And so I think that is a very sort of bleeding edge or interesting paradigm for Bitcoin to sort of be native in a social media setting. And you have some folks doing other things on top of that, considering building exchanges using a similar protocol. So instead of peer-to-peer sending tweet, the equivalent of a tweet or a social media message, you're now sending offers to trade Bitcoin at a certain price for another asset, and somebody can sort of trustlessly come in and take that offer. So you could imagine an exchange or a marketplace coming up around Noster as well. So those are a couple of things that come to mind. One more Bitcoin related, one sort of an offshoot of the Bitcoin sort of ethos.
So, kind of kicking back off here. So recently, and Mike, you and I, we met in Dubai at the Satoshi Roundtable just earlier this year. And I think I told you at the time that one of the companies I'm CEO of, Cryptology Asset Group, we were in the midst of a bit of a re-strategize as well as a rebranding. And we actually accomplished that over the last couple of months. We've gone from Cryptology Asset Group now to the Samara Asset Group. And one of the things that we really wanted to focus on is because both myself as well as our biggest investor, Christian Angemeyer, we're core libertarians. We're libertarians all the way down to our core, right? So the Bitcoin mythos has always been something that speaks to us very well. And one of the things that we've done, and one of the reasons we abandoned the cryptology name, is that we do believe that crypto kind of as a core construct, sure, I do think there is staying power for certain protocols. As a libertarian, it's not necessarily my judgment or it's not necessarily on me to judge what other protocols people want to use. But at the end of the day, I see nothing as anything but inferior, or I see everything as inferior to Bitcoin. That's just my personal viewpoint. And that's where I think you and I, when we met at the Satoshi Roundtable, one of the things I asked you is, how can we get involved with the development? How do we support the core developers of Bitcoin? And this is where it was very fortuitous that we had the opportunity to meet, because we're very excited as Samara that we're going to be continuing to fund a developer per year for the next 3 years. So I really wanted to thank you for giving us that opportunity to do something that we can help drive the development of Bitcoin forward.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys for that donation. Congratulations on the rebranding. And I think it really does take a bit of courage to sort of fight against the stream, the crypto stream. And so kudos to you for doing that. And I think, yeah, and if you harken back to earlier in our conversation where this was a nights and weekends, these developers are sort of giving up their time. Well, now we're in a more mature spot as an industry and even as a set of developers contributing to the protocol. And we have some very talented people that should be compensated for that. And at the end of the day, Bitcoin is different in a lot of ways. And one way that it's different is that there is no foundation. There is no set of funds to fund this work. Satoshi didn't leave his coins for Brink or another organization, fortunately or unfortunately. And so all of this is sort of done in a tragedy of the commons type way, in that the developers are either going to give their time on their own dime to donate to Bitcoin software, Bitcoin protocol work, or someone's going to donate money to facilitate that person being able to spend the time on the Bitcoin software and protocol. There's really no two ways about it. Like, someone's going to have to give up something in order to work on this. There's no pre-mine. There's no developer fund that comes from the mining or anything like that. And so it's purely voluntary, back to your libertarian comment. And so we think that that's Bitcoin's ethos, right? And so we're just one organization contributing, but we think we fill a niche in that other organizations that have sponsored Bitcoin developers previously haven't done so in a way that allows contributions from the community. So, for example, there's Blockstream, there's Chaincode, there's Spiral, which is part of Block, and all of those different organizations are doing great work, and I consider them our partners in this effort. But you can't donate to those organizations. So if you wanted to further Bitcoin development, research and development, and onboarding new developers and sustaining existing developers, Brink was the first and is the major player in the 501c3 space in order to facilitate this support. And so there was an article, I think, on CoinDesk late last year that BitMEX had done some research about who's contributing to Bitcoin Core, who's doing important review on the code, and their findings showed that Brink grantees, the developers that we've chosen to fund, were contributing not only new code and tests at the highest clip, but also reviewing other people's code and reviewing the code at the highest clip. And so we like to pat ourselves on the back about that, and we like to pat the developers on the back about that. Yeah, and we enjoy that. At the same time, noting that Brink didn't really put a dollar towards any of that. That was entirely community funded, right? So there's folks like yourselves that have contributed. There's individuals that have contributed to us. We have some folks that are putting in, recurring credit card donations. And it's really a community effort, and we think that's we're happy to see the community support our efforts in that way. And we think that's in line with the Bitcoin ethos of voluntary contribution.
I mean, I couldn't agree more, and I truly do admire, all the great work that you guys are doing, help to organizing, connecting volunteers, connecting donators with those that are building in the core network. It really is astounding and fascinating stuff to see. But for instance, from my side, if I didn't have the fortuitous moment to meet you in Dubai, I would have not known how to get involved with this. That was one of my main things doing at Satoshi this year. I wanted to learn how do I learn more about mining? We're invested in a big mining corporation through Samara Asset Group. So how do I learn more about this? How do I learn more about investing in the companies and the protocols that are being built around Lightning? So granted, I was lucky enough to meet Alex over at River, and he's been helping guide me through that process. How do I get involved with helping core developers? Well, again, lucky enough to meet you. So for those out there, like me, or those that are out there that believe in Bitcoin, believe in its ongoing development, and want to contribute to this, it's not like they just walk into you on the street, kind of like how I did. How do they get involved? What's the next step for somebody like that to learn more about how to get involved with what it is that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are a great group of technologists, but I would say that we need to improve ourselves in terms of how we market, or how we market the work that we've done and that our grantees have done. So I do think there's room for improvement on our side. And being on podcasts like this that get us exposed to a different audience, different than our sort of more technical developer audience, is one way of doing that. So thank you guys for having me on. And folks that are interested in supporting Bitcoin development, Bitcoin research, work on the Bitcoin software, some of the underlying pieces of what we talked about today, you can reach out to us at Brink. So we have a website, brink.dev, DEV, and that's our organization's website. And folks are also free to email me, mike@brink.dev. And quite frankly, I find that it's useful just to have those conversations and inform people about what we're doing, even going through some of the grantees and the work that they're doing. Some folks just aren't familiar with it, even if they kind of knew that there was some Bitcoin development going on. So I'm happy to have those conversations, and happy to discuss this. This is what we do. This is what we're passionate about. So come visit us at brink.dev. You can find us on Twitter as well. We also have a news source that I mentioned earlier, Bitcoin Optech, which is bitcoinops.org, which provides a lot of interesting content about stuff that not only our developers at Brink are working on, but the broader ecosystem as well.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm very happy to have met you. We are very happy to be able to provide a donation from Samara Asset Group to Brink, to your organization, to help fund developers as they continue to work on the Bitcoin network. Mike, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. I know in the interest of time, we got to jump off, but I really can't appreciate your time anymore, brother.
Yeah, thank you for your donation. Thank you for giving us this platform, and for me to be the inaugural guest.
Yes, sir. Couldn't think of anybody else better. Have a great one,
Cheers.
guys.